Welcome to Games From Folktales, a podcast that mixes historical research and tabletop role-playing settings. I'm your host, Timothy Ferguson. This week, historical witch trials in England. Mostly for the Maginomia role-playing game. Dear listener, this was the least pleasant of the many things I've worked through to find you historical material. This book is a summary of witch trials written by an early English anti-feminist author. It's a long litany of people killing aged and neurodivergent women. That being noted, there's material here for 3 episodes. This first one gives a legend and then the legal framework that Maginomia characters are working within. The others, which will be published, 1 per month, have odd demons that would be suitable for Ars Magica. Thanks to the LibriVox readers, I'd suggest the first demon, in The Witch of Berkeley, could be a reskin of any potent false god. Be aware there's a period racist epithet within the text.
Witch Stories by E. Lynn Linton. The Witch of Berkeley. Read by April 6090. One of our earliest English witches, so early indeed that she becomes mythical and misty, and out of all possible proportion, was the celebrated Witch of Berkeley, who got the reward of her sins in the middle of the 9th century, leaving behind her a tremendous lesson, by which, however, after generations did not much profit. The witch had been rich, and the witch had been gay, but the moment of reckoning had to come in the morning. The feast had been noble and well enjoyed, but the terrible account had to be paid when all was over. And the poor witch found her ruddy-cheeked apple, now that the rind was off and eaten, filled with nothing but dust and ashes, which she must digest as best she may. As the moment of her death approached, she called for the monks and the nuns of the neighboring monasteries, and sent for her children to hear her confession. And then she told them of the compact she had made, and how the devil was to come for her body as well as her soul. "But," said she, "sew me in the hide of a stag, then place me in a stone coffin, and fasten in the covering lead and iron. Upon this place another stone, and chain the whole down with heavy chains of iron. Let 50 psalms be sung each night, and 50 masses be said by day, to break the power of the demons. If you can thus keep my body for 3 nights safe, on the 4th day you may bury it. The devil will have sought and not found." The monks and the nuns did as they were desired, and on the 1st night, though the demons kept up a loud howling and wailing outside the church, the priests conquered, and the old witch slept undisturbed. On the 2nd night, the demons were more fierce and clamorous, and the monks and the nuns told their beads faster and faster, but the fiends were getting more powerful as time went on, and at last broke open the gates of the monastery, in spite of prayer and bolt and bar, and 2 chains of the coffin burst asunder, but the middle one held firm. On the 3rd night the fiends raged sore and wild. The monastery was shaken to its foundations, and the monks and the nuns almost forgot their paters, their abs, in the uproar that drowned their voices and quailed their hearts. But they still went on, until, with an awful crash and a yell from all the smaller demons about, a devil larger and more terrible than any that had come yet stalked into the church and up to the foot of the altar, where the old woman and her coffin lay. Here he stopped and bade the witch rise and follow him. Piteously she answered that she could not. She was kept down by the chain in the middle. But the devil soon settled that difficulty, for he put his foot to the coffin and broke the iron chain like a bit of burnt thread. Then off flew the covering of lead and iron, and there lay the witch, pale and horrible to see. Slowly she uprose, blue, dead, stark, as she was, and then the devil took her by the hand and led her to the door where stood a gigantic black horse, whose back was all studded with iron spikes, and whose nostrils, breathing fire, told of his infernal manger below. The devil vaulted into the saddle, flung the witch on before him, and off and away they rode, the yells of the clamoring demons, and the shrieks of the tortured soul, sounding for hours, far and wide, in the ears of the monks and the nuns. So here, too, in this legend, as in all the rest, the devil is greater than God, and prayer and penitence inefficacious to redeem inequity.
Witch Stories by E. Lynn Linton. Early Historic Trials. Read by Nicole DiDio, Calverton, Maryland, 2023. Coming out from these purely legendary times, we find ourselves on the more solid ground of an actual legal record, the Abbreviatio Placatorum, which informs us that in the 10th year of King John's reign, Agnes, the wife of Otto the merchant, accused Gideon of sorcery, de sorceria, and she was acquitted by the judgment of the hot iron. This is the earliest historic trial to be found in any legal document in England. Nothing more appears until 1324, when 2 Coventry men, specially appointed out of the 27 implicated, undertook the slaying of the king, Edward II. The 2 dispensers his favourites, the prior of Coventry, his caterer, and his steward, because they had oppressed the town and dealt unrighteously with its inhabitants. These 2 men went to a famous necromancer, then living in Coventry, called Master John of Nottingham, whom, with his servant Robert Marshall of Leicester, they engaged to perform the work required. But Robert Marshall proved faithless and betrayed his master to the authorities, telling them how they had received a sum of money for the work in hand, with which sum of money they had bought 7 pounds of wax and 2 yards of canvas, to make 7 images, 6 for the 6 already enumerated, the 7th for one Richard de Lowe, who had done no one any harm, but on whom they wished to try the effect of the spell, as a modern anatomist would try his experiments on cats, or dogs, or rabbits. He told them how he and Master John of Nottingham had been to a ruined house under Shortley Park, about half a league from Coventry, where they remained at work from the Monday after the feast of St. Nicholas to the Saturday after the feast of Ascension, making these images of wax and canvas by which they were to bewitch their noble enemies to death. And first, to try the potency of the charm, Master John took a long leaden pin and struck it 2 inches deep into the forehead of the image representing Richard de Lowe, upon which Richard was found writhing and in great pain, screaming "Harrow!" and having no knowledge of any man, and so he languished for some days. Then Master John drew out the leaden pin from the brow and struck it into the heart of the image, when immediately Richard de Lowe died, as any number of witnesses could testify. The necromancer and his man, and the 27 Coventry men implicated in this bit of sorcery, were tried at common law and acquitted for want of evidence. That same year, too, occurred one of the most picturesque trials for witchcraft known, the trial of Dame Alice Kreitler, which Mr. Wright, with so much industry and learning, had exhumed from the dusty old records where it was buried, and set out into the light of present knowledge and apprehension. But Dame Alice was an Irishwoman, and so does not rightly come into a book on English witches. Else it would be pleasant, if sad, labor to tell how she was arrested on the charge of holding nightly conferences with her spirit or familiar, artisan, who was sometimes a cat, and sometimes a black shaggy dog, and sometimes a black man with 2 tall black companions, each carrying an iron rod in his hand, to which fiendish Proteus she had sacrificed in the highway 9 red cocks and 9 peacocks' eyes, and also for having, between Complines and twilight, raked all the filth of Kilkenny streets to the doors of her son-in-law, William Owlaw, murmuring to herself, "To the house of William my son, hie all the wealth of Kilkenny town." Of how, too, she blasphemously travestied the Holy Sacrament, having a wafer with the devil's name stamped on it instead of Christ's, and how she had a pipe of ointment wherewith she greased a staff, upon which she bowled and galloped through thick and thin, when and what manner she listed. But it does not belong to my present subject, nor to tell how one of her accomplices, poor, weak Metronilla de Meath, was burnt at Kilkenny, not having strength or courage to resist the monstrous confession forced upon her, but how the other, Basil, escaped according to the natural law by which the strongest always come off the best. Perhaps the fact that Dame Alice took refuge in England may give her a slight claim to a place in these pages, but the question is doubtful, so we must let her go. As also her son-in-law, William Outlaw, whose strict imprisonment of 9 weeks led to no bad result, and, let us hope, cooled his blood, which was a trifle too near to boiling point. When we stumble over the threshold of the chamber where Friars Bacon and Bungay are sleeping, while Stupid Miles is watching the brazen head whose brief solemn words were spoken in vain, going forward just a few paces until we come to the deathbeds of Bungay and Vandermast, and Friar Bacon's clever cheating of the devil at last. But we are still on the outskirts of legendary land, and must go on to the middle of the 14th century before we get a firm hold. About this time, the subject of witchcraft occupied much of the attention and thought of the church, but the priests had not yet quite closed their fingers round it. For in 1371, a man was arrested for sorcery and brought before the justices of the king's bench, by whom he was acquitted for want of evidence, which shows that it was still looked upon merely as an offense against common law. It was only when it became a superstition, which some men are pleased to call religion, that it got stained with its deepest dyes. Early in 1406, Henry IV gave instructions to the Bishop of Norwich to search for the sorcerers, witches, and necromancers reported to be rather rife in that respectable diocese, and if he could not convert them from the evil of their ways, he was to bring them to speedy punishment. And in 1432, the Privy Council ordered to be seized and examined a Franciscan friar of Worcester by name Thomas Northfield, another friar, John Ashwell, John Verley, a clerk, and Marjorie Jordemaine, the same Marjorie generally called the Witch of Eye, who, 9 years later, was burnt at Smithfield for her complicity in the treasonable practices of Dame Eleanor of Gloucester. In 1441, Dame Eleanor herself was arrested and put in hold, for she was suspect of treason, and with her the Witch of Eye, who was burnt, and Roger, a clerk longing to her, who was placed on a high scaffold against St. Paul's Cross on the Sunday, and there, arrayed like he should never thrive in his garments, while heaped up round about were all his instruments taken with him, to be showed among the people, and create a proper fear and horror in their mind. The end of poor Roger the clerk was, that he was dragged from the Tower to Tyburn, there hanged, beheaded, and quartered, his head set on London Bridge, and his 4 quarters sent, one to Hereford, and one to Oxenford, another to York, and the 4th to Cambridge. As for Dame Eleanor, that proud, dark, unscrupulous heroine of romance, everyone knows the story of her disgrace and shame, how she came from London to Westminster, and walked through the streets of the city, barefooted and bareheaded, carrying the waxen taper of 2 pounds weight, and doing penance before all the crowd of citizens assembled to see her, on her foot and hoodles, and how she offered up her taper on the high altar of Poulos, and when all was done, was sent to Chester prison, there to bide while she liveth. After her, in 1478, comes the high and noble Princess Jacquette, Duchess of Bedford, charged with having, by the aid of an image of lead, make like a man of arms, containing the length of a man's finger, and broken in the midst, and made fast with a wire, turned the love of King Edward IV, from one Dame Eleanor Bettler, daughter of the old Earl of Shrewsbury, to whom he was affianced, unto her own child, Elizabeth Grey, sometime wife of Sir John Grey, knight, and in 1483, poor Jane Shore was bound to do penance, walking bareheaded and barefooted, clad only in her kirtle, carrying a wax taper, and acknowledging her sins, because Richard of Gloucester had a withered arm, and wanted to put a few enemies out of the way of that arm and its desires. He employed the same accusation against many of those enemies, but so patently for political motives, and without even the semblance of reason, that these attainders can scarcely be set down in any manner to the charge of witchcraft. Then, in 1484, came the bull of Innocent VIII, which gave authority to the inquisitors to convict, imprison, and punish the unfortunate servants of the devil, who thus found themselves a mark for everyone's shaft. In Henry VIII's time, treasure-seeking was the most fashionable phase of necromancy. There was Neville of Wolsey's household, who consulted Wood, gentleman, magician, and treasure-seeker extraordinary, but only for a charm of magic ring, which should bring him into favour with his prince, saying that his master, the cardinal, had such an one, and he would fain participate. And he did at last get Wood to make him one that would bring him the love of woman. Wood could find treasures wherever hidden, and was sure of the philosopher's stone. Nay, he would jeopard his life, but that he could make gold as he listed, and offered to remain in prison till he had accomplished it. 12 months on silver and 12 and a half on gold. In the same reign, too, was arrested William Stapleton for sorcery. William was a monk of St. Benet in the Holme, Norfolk, and William loved not his monkish life. So he got out, seeking money to buy his dispensation, and not having the money at hand himself, nor knowing how to get it, he took to treasure-seeking as the easiest manner open to him of making a fortune. But his conjurations and his magic staff only led him to some Roman remains, and nothing more, so he borrowed of a friend instead, then settled in Norfolk, and turned to treasure-seeking again, uselessly got into intrigues that did him no good, and had 3 spirits, Andrea, Malchus, Incubus, and Oberon, the last a dumb devil who would not speak, being in the service of my Lord Cardinal. In 1521, the Duke of Buckingham died on the scaffold, led into some imprudent actions by the predictions of his familiar magician, one Friar Hopkins, and Hopkins, to make amends, died broken-hearted shortly after. And there was the Maid of Kent, 1534, Elizabeth Barton, who had traces and gave revelations and was on intimate terms with Mary Magdalene, and the Virgin, who was probably a sensitive made use of by the Catholics to try and frighten the king from his marriage with the gospel eyes. But poor Elizabeth Barton came to a sad pass with her revelations and trances, and Mary Magdalene, who had given her a letter written in heaven and all of gold, forgot to forewarn or shield her from her cruel and shameful end at Tyburn, that cloudy, fitful day of April, with the gallows standing out against the flecked sky, and the poor raving nun, half enthusiast, half impostor, praying bareheaded at its foot, she and her accomplices waiting for the moment to die. In 1541 we find a nobler name on the scaffold, Lord Hungerford, beheaded for procuring certain persons to conspire that they might know how long Henry VIII would live, and that same year an act was passed against false prophecies, and another against conjurations, witchcraft, and sorcery, making it felony without benefit of clergy. But 6 years later, Edward VI abrogated the statute, not for any tenderness to witches, but because it was bound up a prohibition against pulling down crosses. In 1549, Kett's rebellion was troublesome, its vigor due partly to the old prophecy repeated through the plains of Norfolk. Hob, Dick, and Hick, with clubs and clouted shoon, shall fill up Duffin Dale with slaughtered bodies soon. And then we came to nothing more until 1559, when Elizabeth renewed the same article of inquiry for sorcerers, but punishing the first conviction only with the pillory. The following year 8 men were taken up for conjurations and sorcery, and tried at Westminster, where they had to purge themselves by confession, penitence, and a repudiating oath. In 1562, the Earl and Countess of Lennox, Anthony Poole, Anthony Fortescue, and some others were condemned for treason and meddling with sorcerers. Though, indeed, Elizabeth herself was not free from either the superstition or its practice. For did she not patronize Dr. Dee and his scryer John Kelly with his ranting about Madimi in her gown of changeable say, and all the other spirits who came in and out of the showstone and talked just the same kind of rubbish as spirits talk about now in modern circles? But the poor finger-flinger with his tin pictures was a sorcerer not to be protected, so got tried and condemned. Poor figure-flinger. In 1562, the year of Lady Lennox's business, a new act against witchcraft was passed, and in 1589, when Mrs. Dare practiced conjuration against the Queen, for which she was tried, but acquitted for want of evidence. But the queen had excessive anguish in her teeth that year, by night and by day. When Ferdinand, Earl of Derby, died, about this time, of perpetual and unceasing sickness, a waxen image was found in his chamber, stuffed with hair the exact color of his, which sufficiently accounted for his illness and the mysterious manner of his death. Though a Sadducee and skeptic might have whispered of poison, or a physician have spoken of cholera, from which disease indeed, by the minute symptoms so carefully detailed, the poor earl's death seems to have been, if not from poison, which might have produced the same effects. Still, the accusation of sorcery was so convenient, such a cloak for viler sins. The latter half of Elizabeth's reign was disgraced by many witch persecutions, for the subject was beginning to attract painful notice now, and though it was not till James I had set the smouldering fragments all ablaze that the worst of the evils were done, still enough was doing now for the philosopher to deplore and the humanitarian to lament. In 1575 many were hanged at Barking. In 1579 3 were executed at Chelmsford, 4 at Abingdon, and 2 at Cambridge. In 1582, 13 at St. Osyth's, the evidence against one being that she had been heard to talk to something when alone in her house, while the other, a woman, swore that she looked through her window one day when she was out, and there espied a spirit to look out of a portrait from under a cloth, the nose thereof being brown like unto a ferret. In 1585, one was hanged at Tyburn, and one at Stanmore. 1589 saw 3 sent into eternity at Chelmsford. In 1593, we have the witches of Warboy, and 2 years later, 1595, 3 at Barnet and Brainford. In 1597, several at Derby and Stafford. So that, by degrees, the thing came to be a notorious matter of social life, and the poor and the aged and the disliked live in fear and peril daily increasing. At this time, too, possessions were many, and ghosts walked abroad without let or hindrance. Richard Lee saw one at Canterbury, 1575, and Master Gaymore and others saw another at Rye 2 years later. But, says Reginald Scult, certainly some one knave in a white sheet hath consigned and abused many thousands that way, specially when Robin Goodfellow kept such a coil in the country. For you shall understand that these bugs especially are spied and feared of sick folk, children, women, and cowards, which, through weakness of mind and body, are shaken with vain dreams and continual fear. The Scythians, being a stout and warlike nation, as divers writers report, never see any vain sights or spirits. It is a common saying, a lion feareth no bugs. But in our childhood our mothers, maids, have so terrified us with an ugly devil having horns on his head, fire in his mouth, and a tail at his back, eyes like a basin, fangs like a dog, claws like a bear, and skin like a Niger, and a voice roaring like a lion, whereby we start and are afraid when we hear one cry bow. They have so frayed us with bull beggars, spirits, urchins, elves, hags, fairies, satyrs, pawns, fauns, sirens, kit with the candlestick, tritons, centaurs, dwarves, giants, imps, calcuts, conjurers, nymphs, changelings, incubus, Robin Goodfellow, the Sporn, the Mare, the Man in the Oak, the Hell Wain, the Fire Drake, the Puckle, Tom Thumb, Hobgoblin, Tom Tumbler, Boneless, and such other bugs, that we are afraid of our own shadows, insomuch as some never fear the devil but in a dark night, and then a polled sheep is a perilous beast, and many times is taken for our father's soul, specially in a churchyard, where a right hardy man heretofore scant durst pass by night, but his hair would stand upright. For right grave writers report that spirits most often and specially take the shape of women, appearing to monks and co., and of beasts, dogs, swine, horses, goats, cats, hares, of fowls, as crows, night owls, and shriek owls, but they delight most in the likeness of snakes and dragons. All of which wretched and cowardly infidelity was rampant in England when good Queen Bess ruled the land. Rampant, doubly, so that there was no holding in of this furious madness after James the First had got his foot in the stirrup and was riding a race neck and neck with the devil. But I must turn back a few years and tell of...
Thanks to the LibriVox recorders and their production teams, your saga may vary. If you'd like to support this podcast, there's a Patreon. Check the details in the episode description.